Well, good morning. This is Darwin. I know you can't see me very well. It's actually just before sunrise, so the light should continue to come up. I'm actually sitting right out on the coast, right along the beach or above the beach here in Galveston, Texas. I actually rode my bike out. I had admittedly been putting this off for a little while. I was really excited when Jessica and the group had discussed talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and kind of each of our personal stories. I definitely loved the concept, but admittedly putting it sort of into practice, into reality here on the video was somewhat of a daunting task for me, if I'm being honest. So I'm going to just try and go through my story and our story, my family's story, and I will be interested to hear what you think of it and your feedback. So in respect to trying to come up with a theme, I basically came to the word counterintuitive. And so basically something that doesn't necessarily make logical sense, but is nonetheless true. And I think it applies well to both our story that I'm going to share, as well as just diversity, equity, and inclusion in general, with what we're trying to do within our organizations or even society at large. So my wife and I have been married. My wife's name is Nicole. We've been married for almost 15 years. It'll be 15 years here in January. So we're looking forward to celebrating that. Over those 15 years, we have had 3 kids, and actually 4 for a short time, and I'll explain that in just a minute. So we were college sweethearts, met at school in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, and ended up getting married and moving eventually to Texas. We love it down here. And so we had bought our first house in Texas, and about a year later found out we were pregnant. And so 9 months after that, we had Miles biologically. He's our oldest biological son. And we were extremely happy and excited about that. It had actually been pretty challenging getting pregnant with Miles, and so we were happy with that outcome, but recognized within the years after that he, just like every child, was a miracle, but that we weren't necessarily capable of doing it again. And so we actually went through a couple different options, but felt personally that adoption was a good route to consider. Both of us had considered that in the past and had definitely a good idea about it. And so it was a number of years later. Miles was about 3 when we started the adoption process, which if you've ever gone through it, or if you know anyone who's gone through it, it's challenging in its own right, even just the logistics and sort of formality of the process. And so a series of time later, after a lot of paperwork and background checks and details like that, we ended up getting matched with a child in Florida, and his name is Isaiah. And so we actually got matched, and the birth mother picked us. She was actually incarcerated and no longer able to care for Isaiah, and so we ended up adopting Isaiah when he was 2.5 years old, out of Florida, which, as you can imagine, was sort of a fiasco in itself. We spent about 2 weeks in Florida waiting for what's called a state interstate compact. Basically, both Texas and Florida had to agree that the adoption was in the best interest of the child and all the legalities were taken care of before we could effectively come back home. And so we actually spent 2 weeks in January, a number of years back, in Florida. While Florida was having a winter storm, 2 weeks in a hotel with a new toddler and another young child. Miles had come along with us as well. And so after being a family of 3 for a few years, we became a family of 4. And just for context in regard to diversity, equity, and inclusion, my wife and I are both white Caucasian, and so obviously Miles is white Caucasian, and Isaiah is biracial. He's African American and Caucasian. His biological father was African American, his biological mother was Caucasian. And so we adopted Isaiah, what's now been 2006 we got married, 2009 Miles was born. Isaiah was born in 2011 and we adopted him in 2013. So that was 7 years ago. And so we've had Isaiah for 7 years. Then a few years after that, we decided to go the adoption route again. And this time determined that we wanted to stay in Texas. We figured that would be easier because we would be able or eligible to just come home once we'd found and matched with a child. So we went through CPS, DFPS in Texas, if you're familiar with that. Basically the state agency who unfortunately takes children out of their birth homes if the circumstances necessitate that, and bring them into state custody, and then place them with foster homes to either be brought back in with their families if the situation is safe, or potentially adopted as well. And so we signed up to be a part of that program, and it was actually quite a while later. It took about a year to match, but late on a Wednesday evening, we got a call that they were in need of an emergency placement for a 6-month-old Hispanic baby boy. We didn't even have a name at that point. We were just asked yes or no, 6-month-old Hispanic baby boy. And I still remember the night I was on the call that we got from our caseworker, and my wife was gleefully in the background, excitedly nodding her head and agreeing to this situation. And so that was literally about 7:30 p.m. on a Wednesday evening, and by 8:30 p.m., a caseworker who had taken 4 children out of their home, earlier that day, showed up at our doorstep. And so we went from 3 kids, toddler, young child age, to having a baby within an hour. Obviously, we'd had a baby before, but at that point, it had been years in the past. And so we were very excited to have a new baby boy. His name is Eli. And sort of fast forwarding the story, we were able to adopt him about a year and a half later. Both of those stories, so the actual logistics of adoption were not easy at all. Adversity, for lack of a better word, just like everyone has in life. You can see the sun is just starting to come up over the coast as well. That's why I'm out here. It just helps me think it's a great place to be. But from an adversity perspective, we all face adversity, but obviously those kids in those situations are going through something pretty traumatic, and yet they sort of prove their resilience every day. And at the same time, it's really, really hard to go through the process. And so for me, that's kind of how my personal or our personal family story of diversity, equity, and inclusion started. But I will say that that's the only beginning. And that's really what I wanted to talk about, because adversity is a good word for it. But parenting is challenging, as anyone who's a parent knows. And it can be extremely challenging, tiring, exhausting, and at the same time rewarding and a blessing, for lack of a better word, and worthwhile, sort of nonetheless, despite all the adversity, despite the challenge. And I'd go so far to say that, like, if we didn't have adversity in life, we wouldn't sort of know the value of what we have, or what we have perhaps accomplished, or how far we've come. If we didn't have those milestones and challenges along the way, we certainly wouldn't know what we have to be grateful, what we have to be thankful for. So I'm going to be honest as well, though, that parenting is hard. Having been both a biological parent and also a foster and adoptive parent, it's really, really difficult. So I'll quickly share a side story about one of Eli's older sisters. Eli is the youngest of 4 siblings. He actually has additional half-siblings in addition to that. But sort of in the case, there were 4 children involved. He's the youngest and only boy in the situation. and there were 4 older sisters. And so the oldest sister is named Adriana. And as you can imagine, she was the oldest, of course, in the situation, but had gone through more personally in the CPS sort of extraction from the family home than the other children had. Eli doesn't remember anything about that. He doesn't know any other mom or dad besides us because of his age. He's not even really to the age that he'll remember much of anything yet at just 3 years old. But Adriana personally remembers and recalls all of that, and she's sort of struggled for it. And so, as is typical sometimes in these situations, she's bounced around between homes, not for lack of care or concern, but she's got a fair amount of baggage that she has to deal with personally and work through. And so in this whole story, we, for a time, were actually one of those placements. We had hoped that she would be able to come alongside Eli and join. And so for a time, for about 6 months, we were actually fostering her. And unfortunately, and this was a very hard decision to come to, but it wasn't in our personal best interest or family's best interest, or what we honestly believe even her personal best interest from the perspective of the child, to stay in our care. And so she actually went on to a different home placement and has, again, unfortunately bounced through a different series of houses and homes and placements as well. With this last move after she left our house, she's actually done notably better. She's in a specialized program for cases just like this, and she's working through a lot of those things personally for her, working through that adversity and trying to figure things out, trying to find her own value. It's always been there, but kind of discovering it for herself. She's 9 years old now, and so admittedly part of the complication in our home was we have a 9-year-old in Isaiah that couldn't coexist well with Adriana either. But I wanted to come back to sort of the overall struggle that we have in dealing with these complex issues sometimes when life gets really, really messy, and admittedly real as well, because we definitely have good days also. But in dealing with that, going back to kind of what I was saying earlier, parenting is hard, but adoption parenting may even be more challenging. It's admittedly far and away, I can easily and confidently say this, the hardest thing Nicole and I have ever done, ever. And we've lost our home in a hurricane, we've gone through natural disasters, we've seen much of life. And I'm by no means comparing my hurts and pains with anyone else, but I feel like, while we have had, I will still say, a relatively easy life, this was a huge, huge challenge, huge burden, very traumatic and ongoing event that we've chosen to take upon ourselves through adoption. And so again, I definitely recognize that everyone has pain, everyone has drama and trauma that they're working through. Life is not easy. That's often where we sort of truly discover ourselves and find our value, find our worth, and find, to some degree, even our happiness and our joy, sort of in addressing and feeling and dealing with those things. And so with adoption or foster care or choosing the future and livelihood and trying to speak wisdom into kids who really need to hear it, it's really, really challenging. And that's what we've dealt with and wrestled with over these past couple years. And admittedly, this is still ongoing. Every day, we admittedly have the most struggles currently with Isaiah, but Miles has his own regards. We have chosen a family and a path of sort of overcoming trauma. And that impacts our oldest, biological. He didn't necessarily choose this path. We chose this path as a family sort of for him. And so we're having to live through that decision. With Isaiah, we really struggle. He has multiple diagnoses, and both Isaiah and Eli have dealt with drugs in their past, in utero actually, as is common in these situations, unfortunately. And so we're trying to sort of unravel and deal with some of those circumstances. And Isaiah has been diagnosed with ADHD and reactive attachment disorder and oppositional defiance disorder, which is I'll say least favorite or most common that we deal with through counseling and other medication, admittedly, for him. And then Eli, our youngest, actually already at 3 struggles with anger management and sort of a strong temperament. So, long story short, that's my story regarding diversity, equity, inclusion. And here's sort of the concluding factor, like I mentioned up front, or sort of theme running through, is this isn't easy, but it is worthwhile. And so I'd gone on sort of in preparation for this discussion, I'd gone on and sort of looked up. I always want to come to the right word or right description for something. And so I had actually looked up, just Googled, what's the right word for something that is extremely difficult and challenging, but still in the end worthwhile. And it's not even knowing necessarily the outcome or the ending. I don't think there is one. There's not a perfect solution. There to some of these issues I feel like we're facing, I don't even think there's necessarily a resolution. You just figure out how to sort of sustain and live and deal with some of these things because there's not a fix. And so my search on Google actually turned up Quora, which is a site I like. Basically, people can pose questions and get just general answers from anyone else, and then they get upvoted and downvoted as well. And so someone had posed this years back, this exact question that I was asking on Quora, saying, what's a good word to describe something that is the most challenging thing you'd ever done, the biggest adversity, the hardest thing you've ever faced, and yet somehow described as worthwhile? And I'll admit, not all days. My wife and I debate at different times whether this is worth it, but sort of here we are and we're learning from it. And so nonetheless, I really liked one of the Quora answers, which I'll give you in just a moment. But please don't, and I'm being completely honest and vulnerable in this, please don't think I'm noble or we're awesome or anything unusual. This was not done or said or shared at all as a boast, because I recognize even in parenting, I and even we as a couple fail regularly, multiple times on a daily basis, but we're trying. And I was laughing with my wife talking about this the other night. While we frequently fail as parenting, it is fair to say that our children fail at childing fairly consistently as well. And so it is accurate to describe our family as dysfunctional on a regular basis, and so not necessarily something admirable or to be pursued after. So don't think for even a second that we've got this at all figured out. And again, you'll start to see some ties in my story back with the general consensus I feel about diversity, equity, and inclusion at large. And so going back to the Quora piece, the question I liked best there was actually, and excuse the language, but somebody else came back and said if I had to sum it up in a single word, I would actually call it badass. Both the situation and the people involved, and that sort of emphasizes my last point. I really liked that description. It was humorous to me to say, you know what, our situation is kind of badass, and I like to be sort of recognized as badass for even thinking we could possibly try this whole situation that we're in life. And so badass by description is not a good thing. Like, it literally starts off with a negative term and in effect could be considered derogatory. And so I really liked that fitting description, and I thought that was a good answer. I even upvoted it, if you know how Quora works. And so our situation is messy and we're struggling through it, and I don't have the outcome. I don't know what we'll figure out. We have aspirations for each of our kids, just like any parent does. I don't know if they will achieve even their potential, but that's sort of the beauty of this whole experiment that we call life, is that I can only do the best I can do. I can only be me for today. And I'm challenging my children to the exact same sentiment and hope, that they have strengths and they have weaknesses and they have challenges and opportunities that they're going to have to work through. And so I believe, albeit counterintuitive, like I said up front, this whole concept is, to me, very counterintuitive. I think this is what we face as organizations and as a society for wrestling with truly achieving something admirable or notable or even magnificent through diversity, equity, and inclusion. The more we get into it, the messier it gets. The more we try, the more we struggle. These things are counterintuitive. They're opposite in nature, but nonetheless, they are worth pursuing, and they are true, and they are real, and they are worthwhile. So, in summary, I think all of us who are actively pursuing and diligently seeking out diversity, equity, inclusion can aptly be described as badass. So thanks for being a part of it, and I look forward to this discussion. Thanks.